So what a surprise. 5 stars in The Guardian. We had a nice, I haven't read it in full, I just looked at it very, very briefly just now. But we had a very thoughtful review in the Times from Rachel Campbell-Johnson. They've probably sold all of their copies by now. There's probably been a run on newspapers this morning. So we'll try and circulate some of the reviews in due course. So, what I'm going to try and do this morning, I'm not going to try and pack everything I know about every single picture into the short time that I've got. But I have been over the last week talking to a lot of people, talking to a lot of journalists, and slightly trying to second guess the sort of questions that people are going to ask you, so that you can be prepared to answer the sort of frequently asked questions. So let me start by giving you a bit of background. The exhibition started with this. This is our Stubbs, the Carter Thelwall family. One of our many 18th century paintings. And this summer, it's the turn of an 18th century exhibition. So we had Canaletto last summer. The year before that, in the spring season, we had Joseph Wright. So 18th century has come around again. Hurrah. So we wanted to look at Stubbs, but not the Stubbs that everybody knows doing race horses and families out riding like this and hunting scenes and so on. We wanted to look at a different side of Stubbs and show people what an extraordinary person he was. So in a way, this is an exhibition of portraits, but portraits with a difference in that they are not people. So Stubbs didn't just paint horses, he was a very, very fine painter of dogs. The owners of hunting horses also owned dogs. They had pet dogs, so he does some beautiful dog paintings. This is just one example. But far more importantly to his contemporaries and to history, he made pictures of wild animals. This is one of the most famous examples. He made them for 2 reasons. Firstly, for scientific inquiry. So this is the first specimen of a kangaroo that was ever brought to Europe. Unfortunately, it didn't get here alive. It was eaten on the way, but it was brought back from Captain Cook's voyage on the Endeavour by Joseph Banks, and Stubbs had to use what remnants there were of the kangaroo to try and sort of reconstruct what a kangaroo probably looked like. Stubbs also uses wild animals very much for artistic expression. This is a sort of great exhibition piece. It wasn't made for a particular patron, but it was made to impress the exhibition-going public. The main thing that he does in these sort of pictures is to express the sort of fashionable artistic movement of his day, which was the sublime. To put it very, very simply, the sublime is a combination of beautiful with scary, or with awesome in the proper sense of the word, awe-inspiring. So this, a very beautiful scene, a beautiful but rather dark landscape with 2 beautiful animals, one of them eating the other. So it's a very sort of cosmic, universal subject, but very, very beautifully rendered. So the idea of these pictures is that they would affect people's feelings. They would stir feelings of awe, of terror, of sympathy as well. And so it was about touching people's emotions as well as their senses. The other thing that Stubbs does with wild animals is to experiment with some quite revolutionary techniques. So he worked a lot in enamel. This is probably his first enamel painting. and he also worked as a printmaker. So most of the prints that you see in the exhibition are not, they're not copies after Stubbs by professional printmakers. They are Stubbs's own original work. So, just to set the scene a bit and to remind you why the 18th century is such an exciting period, and why Stubbs is so important within his period. The first thing that's easy to forget is how important animals, and in particular horses, are to European society. Everybody is completely dependent on horses. So they are cars, they are lorries, tractors, and tanks as well. They go into battle. They're used for fun, they're used for racing and for hunting. They're also used, as I said just now, for military purposes. They're used in building sites. They're used as we would use heavy plant on a building site now. So they are absolutely key to the functioning of society. The 18th century is also a great age of exploration. So if you think about what was going on down the road in New King Street with the Herschels exploring outer space, you get Captain Cook exploring the uncharted territories of the world. And Stubbs worked closely with Joseph Banks, who travelled with Cook as a botanist. It's a time when the East India Company is going into the jungles and discovering new things there. And also a time when people are exploring within. They're exploring the inner workings of the human body. Animals are an important part of that. The discovery of animals is something that people are taking very seriously. Animals are being classified in the same way that plants are being classified by people like Linnaeus. They're being given their Latin names, they're being placed in a sequence or a tree of species. And in order to do that, you need to discover all the different species that there are. You need to understand their relationship to each other. Animals are also quite important in the entertainment industry. This is a period when they have a great thirst for all sorts of different kinds of entertainment, very much like us now. So music, theatre, art are all flourishing, but also things like sideshows and shows of peculiar new things, and particularly wild beast shows, animal shows, which travel around. So this is a poster for Pidcock's Menagerie, and some of these animals would have actually travelled around the country. This was a great form of entertainment. Here is another view from 1812 of Pidcock's, after it had been taken over by someone called Politos, but was still in central London. So you can see the sort of conditions that the animals were kept in, and I think that's important to bear in mind when you're looking at Stubbs's work. We've also found this. This is a newspaper that we have downstairs from 1817, and it shows you some of the animals that came to Bath in a show in the large yard near the Newmarket, Walcott Street. That's slightly concealed up there, can you see? So I suppose it would have been, you know where that car park is? If you can imagine that filled with all these animals. A male and female lion in one den, 2 zebras, and the nilgau. I'll be talking a lot more about the nilgau later on. And then at the end, admittance to see the whole of the menagerie, 1 shilling, feeding time 8:30, 2 shillings. So it costs you to see the animals. It's also a period in the art world where there's a great debate going on between art and nature. So in the book, I've put 2 contradictory quotes by 2 men who were both quite important in Stubbs's life. Sir Joshua Reynolds and William Hunter, they were both teachers at the Royal Academy. One was the president of the Academy, teacher of painting. The other, William Hunter, taught anatomy. So Reynolds says in his discourses in 1770, nature herself is not to be too closely copied. A mere copier of nature can never produce anything great, can never raise and enlarge the conceptions or warm the heart of the spectator. So he's saying you've actually got to mess around slightly with what you see. You've got to use artistic license. You can't be too realistic because you need to create an image that moves people, that has a poetic side to it. Hunter, completely the opposite. He says a painter cannot copy nature too exactly. In other words, you've got to be as exact as you can in copying nature. Make the deception as strong as you can. And this is the sort of side that Stubbs prefers to be associated with, although, as we'll see, there is actually a lot of artistic language going on in many of his pictures. So I'm going to just run very, very quickly through Stubbs's life. This is a wonderful drawing of him by his friend Ozias Humphrey, and I put it in for two reasons. One is that the portrait of him that we have at the front of the exhibition is based on this one. Also because Humphrey was his biographer. This was drawn in 1777, and most of the works in the exhibition are from this period. So he's in his 50s, and I hope this gives you a sense of the sort of very practical, down-to-earth person he was. Notice, for example, that he's not wearing a wig. He's wearing his own hair. There's not much of it. He's not somebody who has a very high regard for looking fashionable. So the little that we do know about his life has mostly come from Humphrey's biography, which seems to have been largely dictated by Stubbs. If you are interested in Stubbs and learning more about his life, there is a wonderful biography by Robin Blake, who's coming to talk at the study day at the end of July. He came to the private view the other evening, and it's an excellent book. Unfortunately, it's out of print, so we can't sell it in the shop, but you may be able to find it in other retail outlets. So he's contemporary with Reynolds and contemporary with Gainsborough, but he outlives them all. He has a very long life and a very healthy life. He didn't drink, he walked a lot. He seems to have been very, very strong, as we'll see. As an artist, he specialises in horses, but at a time when there's this hierarchy of genres. If you came to my talk about 18th century painting some months ago, I went through all that hierarchy then, how at the top you have history painting, the sort of mythological and historical subjects, and at the bottom you have still life. And animal painting is just above still life. Now, unfortunately for artists, there's a great deal of snobbery about your status. If you're a still life painter, you're nobody very important. If you're a history painter making a big show in the exhibitions, then you're highly regarded. But the problem is that people don't actually need history paintings. British patrons want pictures of their wives, pictures of their land, and pictures of their horses. So you can make a good living as a horse painter. His social background, he was born in Liverpool and his father was a currier. Now, a currier works with skins. He's not a tanner, so he's not dealing with raw hide and with sort of bits of dead animals. It's actually much more of an artisan business, refining the skins and making very fine materials for bookbinding and gloves and things. So I think he was much more a businessman. Stubbs himself was fascinated by animals from a very young age, and we know that as a child he was already exploring anatomy and dissecting animals. At the same time, he showed a great talent for drawing, so he was sent to this man, Hamlet Winstanley, to learn how to paint. Winstanley was a portrait painter. Now, the way that you learn to paint is by copying, and Stubbs hated copying. He only stayed a few months with Winstanley. He threw up this wonderful opportunity. According to his biography, he left vowing he would for the future look into nature for himself and consult and study her only. So he claims not to be interested in the old masters or classical art or anything like that. So he goes back to his father's shop and teaches himself to paint, and he gradually began to get portrait commissions. This is one of the very earliest existing one. Sir Henry and Elizabeth Nelthorpe. You'll know that name Nelthorpe from our Leotard portrait. These people are cousins of Sir James Nelthorpe, who was he was a Leeds branch of the family. So these people lived in North Lincolnshire. Then comes, in a way, the most interesting but most mysterious period of his life. When he lived mainly in York, he was an itinerant portrait painter around the north of England. In York, he worked as an anatomist. So he was exploring the structure of the human body for educational and medical purposes. That's the most famous of 17th century anatomy lessons in the Netherlands, where they were much more relaxed about allowing people to use cadavers for dissection. In Britain, it was very, very, very difficult to get hold of dead bodies. It was illegal. You would get hold of them by whatever means you could, but whatever means it would be taking people's bodies without their consent, essentially. Anatomy is also very important for art. And here is William Hunter, who was the great anatomist of his day, along with his brother John, at the Royal Academy. And here are all the academicians. So this chap here in the red coat with the ear trumpet, that is actually Sir Joshua himself, listening to Hunter, who is demonstrating the structure of a human body. Here is a whole live moving human body alongside what's called an écorché. So it's had all the skin stripped off, and it's a sculpture just with the muscles and the skeleton, so you can see how the body is built. So this is what fascinates Stubbs, partly as an artist, but also just because he's interested in the science in its own right. He makes a very brief grand tour to Rome, but he didn't stay long there. He claimed that the reason he went there was to convince himself that nature was and is always superior to art, whether Greek or Roman, and having renewed this conviction, he immediately resolved upon returning home. Then in 1756, soon after that grand tour, his wife has died, and that's what enabled him to go abroad. Don't know who looked after his children, but it's all quite mysterious what was going on there. But in 1756, he embarks on the most important project of his life, the anatomy of the horse. He got the idea for this while he was working in York on human bodies, but he undertook this in a very remote place, a farmhouse in North Lincolnshire, and the farmhouse was probably lent to him or arranged for him by Lady Nelthorpe, whose portrait you saw just now. Now, Lady Nelthorpe's daughter Charlotte is actually the lady riding in the carriage in our portrait upstairs, so she became Mrs. Carter Thelwall. So that's the connection with Stubbs's anatomy. So he would take old farm horses and string them up in a barn. He had a very sophisticated apparatus, using planks under their feet so that they didn't look like they were dangling too much. They looked like they were walking. And he would very, very carefully, layer by layer, take them apart over the course of 6 weeks. Very heavy labour to handle these creatures, cold Very smelly, very, very dangerous, because if he had caught something, that would have been it. He was very fortunate to survive, really. So he spent 18 months. He made 42 drawings and used 12 horses, and produced a complete study of the muscles and skeletal structure of the horse. He didn't look at the internal organs, but the bits that are of most interest to an artist. These are the finished drawings from the Royal Academy, and they were used for teaching for many years in the Royal Academy. So his next task was to get the drawings published as a useful book, but he couldn't find anybody to turn his drawings into engravings. The professional engravers were worried because they didn't really understand all these lines and how everything fitted together. They'd not seen the real thing. So in the end, Stubbs taught himself to do etching and made the prints himself and published them in 1766. Each plate took him 4 months to engrave. The book is so important because it's the first really serious anatomy since 1598. This is the book that everyone had been using since then, the Ruini's Anatomy. This is an edition from about 1618, but you can see it's not that sophisticated. So all of the vets, all the people working with horses, they really didn't know how it all fitted together. As soon as Stubbs has arrived in London, so he arrives in London in the late 1750s, mainly to try and sell his anatomy to a publisher. As soon as he arrives in London, major patrons begin to come forward to buy horse portraits from him. The first is Duke of Richmond. Here he is, this very tall man here with his hunt. So this is one of the very earliest of Stubbs's horse hunting scenes. Very complex composition, very beautifully sensitive painting of the animals. The dogs are wonderful. And each is a portrait of an individual horse or an individual dog. You need to remember that these aristocratic patrons are professional horse breeders. They're professional dog breeders. They really, really know their horse flesh. And what they most admire in Stubbs is that truthfulness to nature. So very, very early on, Stubbs is producing the most wonderful horse paintings. By the mid-1760s, he's painted some of the most famous horses in the country for some of the wealthiest and most famous landowners. So here is Whistlejacket. Very quickly, I'll just flash him up there. This was painted for Stubbs's most generous politician, Lord Rockingham, as an example of a perfect specimen. So it was never meant to have a rider. It's not a riding or racing scene. It's just, here is a perfect specimen of an Arabian stallion. People say things like, well, you know, his neck's too thick. But yes, the necks were thick because they were trained to use their necks, and the muscles were very highly developed. The ears are too small, but they used to cut the ears to make them look smaller. So this is anatomically correct. So suddenly Stubbs is very successful. He's a major exhibitor at the Society of Artists, and he eventually became president of the Society of Artists in 1772. So he's right at the heart of the London art world. Okay, so to look at the exhibition itself. The exhibition opens with the section which is called George Stubbs Animalium Pictor, painter of animals, and that name has actually come from this engraving. And the reason I've chosen that name was to talk about his identity as a painter of animals, but not as an animal painter, which is the someone who just paints animals and paints them for pub signs or whatever, but a painter of animals. So somebody who is a very sophisticated type of artist, but who specialises in animals. The first section includes this. This is our sort of jumping off point. So as I said, this is Charlotte Nelthorpe, and it was her mother who almost certainly enabled Stubbs to do his anatomy in that lonesome barn. We've also got some of the anatomy drawings in that section. And we've contrasted this picture. The vehicle that they're riding in is called a phaeton. And the reason it's called a phaeton is because it's very fast and quite dangerous. And it's named after this character here. This is Phaeton, the son of the sun god Helios. And the story is that Phaeton goes to his dad and he says, Dad, can I drive your car? And he persuades him to drive his car, which is actually the sun. So this is the sun which rides across the heavens. It starts off in the east at dawn and ends up in the west at sunset. He doesn't know how to drive it properly. He can't handle the horses, and disaster ensues. So down here you can see this is the creation of the Sahara Desert. It's being burnt up because he's getting too close to the earth. So this is one of Stubbs' earliest attempts at a history painting. It was exhibited at the Society of Artists in 1762, and it was a real success because it was acquired by Sir Joshua Reynolds himself. Notice that for his history painting, he chooses, yes, a mythological subject, but one that's got horses in it. So the horses are the real stars here. The figure is quite weak, really, but the horses are incredibly well observed. And in the audio guide, we asked a horse psychologist to look at this picture, and she recognised exactly what was going on in these horses' heads. The second section is called Nature, and this is the green bit in the middle, green as in jungle. All of the pictures of sort of specimens of new species. Here is the zebra. The zebra is not here. The zebra is in New Haven at the Yale Centre for British Art, but I've put her up anyway because she is Stubbs' starting point, his first involvement with exotic animals. She arrived in London from the Cape in 1762, and she was described by the media as a painted African ass. She was given to the Queen, and she became a great celebrity because the Queen kept her in a part of the land behind Buckingham House, which was accessible to the public. So there was just a fence dividing this zebra off from the public. You can imagine the sort of things that the media had to say about the Queen's ass. There were all sorts of scurrilous verses and things going on, and cartoons, and the zebra became a great celebrity. She was in satirical cartoons and all sorts of things. Stubbs jumps on this celebrity bandwagon and paints a portrait of the zebra. He doesn't have to ask the Queen's permission because there she is wandering in the park. And he exhibits this at the Society of Artists in 1763. And this is the public image that Stubbs wants to present, not somebody who paints people's private commissions of hunters and racehorses, but somebody who does something a bit different. And here is an animal that nobody had ever seen before. So it rouses a lot of interest, and particularly among the scientific community. So William Hunter, who is very familiar with the zebra, he's the Queen's physician, and so he knows the Queen's animal collection very well. And he sees this picture, and this is what draws Stubbs to his attention as a very, very useful artist, because William Hunter is studying, alongside many others, he's studying all these funny animals which were arriving mainly from India, but also from Africa, and of course from the Americas. He was studying them, and he wanted records of what they looked like. But to do that, he needed an artist who knew exactly what he was doing. So this was Hunter's first commission, the nilgai. This, again, is not in the exhibition, but I put it in because we've got two other versions of this image. One was an engraving that was made after Stubbs's painting, and the other one is Thomas Bewick's book, The Cabinet of Quadrupeds, and this is used as an illustration by Bewick. So this becomes the definitive image of a nilgai. What is a nilgai, people will ask? Well, it's a kind of an Indian antelope. They're quite rare in India nowadays, but they're very common in the United States, they are being very actively bred because they are delicious, apparently. If you go into a trendy restaurant on the West Coast, it'll be at the top of the menu. Nilgai antelope steaks. They're very high in protein and very low in fat. And this is one of the things that Hunter was interested in. Can we breed these animals? Do they have an economic value? His other interest was, where do they fit in the chain or in the tree or whatever structure it is that animals fit into? Is it a deer? Is it a goat? Is it a cattle? What is it? Is it maybe a cross between the two? What would happen if you crossed a deer with a cow? Would you get something like this? So he and the other scientists were very, very interested in these sort of pre-Darwinian ideas. Here is the moose, and the moose is in our exhibition. We love the moose. He's very young. He's only a little calf. He's a yearling, and he was hunted in Canada, given to the governor of Quebec, who brought him to England and brought him to Stubbs's patron, the Duke of Richmond. He lived at Goodwood, and Hunter was very interested in this moose, again because he was a sort of in-between, middling sort of animal. He's a kind of a deer, but he's also a kind of a horse. If you cross a deer with a horse, do you get a moose? If you cross a moose with a horse, what happens? So he was very interested in doing some quite sort of Frankenstein-style experiments. The other thing he was interested in was to show that this moose was not a missing link, and that's why he's put these horns in. These are the horns of a fully grown moose, and he wanted to find out whether this little moose was going to grow horns like this or horns like that, because those are the horns from his collection which had been dug up in an Irish peat bog. They're the horns of a megaloceros, or European prehistoric elk, and they are enormous. You can see how big they are. These are ordinary moose horns, so these are like the ones in the picture. He wanted to show that the moose and the Irish elk were two quite different species, and that the Irish elk was actually extinct. So this is a 2-year-old moose, and look at them on the wall in the gallery and you'll see how different they are, and you'll see how closely Stubbs has observed those differences and all those details of all the different parts of the animal, but also the character of the animal, I think, shines through so strongly. He was very friendly and very harmless. These are some earlier attempts at drawing moose for scientific books, and you can see that they didn't quite get it right. The problem was that they were looking at them in the wild, and if you see an animal in the wild, you can't catch it, you can't get a good enough impression of it. Whereas with Stubbs, all the animals are coming to him, and he is observing them in captivity, and that means he can watch them for as long as he likes. He would stay on the estate at Goodwood and just watch the moose for days so that he got it exactly right. This is another example of that. This is a beautiful, beautiful drawing of a mouse lemur. It's all one lemur. They're very tiny little things. They're only about 27 centimetres, so about 12 inches, including the tail. It's all the one and the same lemur, but in different poses. So he's not only observing its appearance, he's also observing its behaviour. Here is the monkey. Monkeys, of course, were very, very common by this time in Britain. They were very common pets. This is a kind of monkey called a crab-eating macaque. They're from Southeast Asia, but they do also eat fruit as well. And do listen to the audio guide. We asked Daphne Wright to talk about this monkey. She's a local artist, and she said some really, really extraordinary things about it, so do enjoy that. Finally, the tigress. This is the Duke of Marlborough's tigress. What a beautiful creature she is. You'll notice that she's slightly overfed. She used to get fed with beef, and probably didn't get much exercise because she was in an enclosure at Blenheim. So she actually owes quite a lot, I think, to the old masters. And this is where Stubbs, like Gainsborough, is always hiding his knowledge of artistic tradition. But she's actually represented in the exhibition by this mezzotint. The mezzotint was made by a man called John Dixon, and it's extra big. It was described as the finest mezzotinto that ever was engraved. So we have a copy of that in our exhibition. The third section of the exhibition, on a red background, is called History. And these are the more sort of history paintings, the things that Stubbs would have made for exhibition, the big, impressive works. So this is a den of lions. This has been kindly lent to us by the Nelthorpe family. For exhibitions, people don't just want a picture of an animal that shows us precisely what it looks like, that's very precise, but that doesn't have much else going on. They want stories. They want, as Reynolds observed, they want to be moved. And so Stubbs visits the animals, he watches them, but then he makes a story. And this is a true story, actually. I'm sure he would have observed this. Again, listen to the audio guide, listen to Simon King, because he'll tell you exactly what's going on. We had quite a job with his contribution. We had to edit it quite a lot, but I hope you still get the gist of what's going on here. A very, very accurate observation, not just of their appearance, but also of their behaviour. Again, this picture tells a story. It's not just two deer just very statically standing. It's a sort of a conversation piece. He's taken these two deer and made it into a little story of courtship, a little scene from an operetta, if you like. It's very reminiscent of, say, a conversation piece by Arthur Davis or something like that, only the landscape and the animals are painted so much more realistically. One of the very interesting things that the audio guide threw up for this was we spoke to a man called Paul Messenger who works with red deer. He's a red deer farmer. He works with these animals every single day. And he thought that this hind here looked very, very scrawny. They should be very furry. They should have fur all over their faces and necks. And she almost looks like she's been shaved. Not only that, but her face is very, very emaciated. And the conclusion that we came to is that Stubbs must have been working from a dissected skull and sort of painted his dissection, and he's got all the sort of nerves and things very clearly showing, and then he sort of forgot to put the fur back on afterwards. And he continued throughout his life to dissect whatever animals he could get his hands on, including a tiger. Isn't that incredible? He got hold of big cats, and he, just as he'd done with horses when he was young, he took them apart layer by layer by layer because he needed to know how they were built. This was actually made for an extraordinary work that he never finished, an anatomical exposition of a man, a tiger, and a fowl. He was comparing the anatomy of man, tiger, and fowl, and the result that you get is a comparison of these three very different animals, but also very similar animals, which suggests a close relationship. So it's the beginnings of the idea of species all being connected in a great chain. So he loves tigers, he loves big cats, and here we have this wonderful picture, tigers at play. This is a very good example of the sublime because they're beautiful, they're also very cute. They will remind people instantly of kittens. People wouldn't really have seen leopards at this time, but they wouldn't have seen them at close quarters. But here you see, oh, well, they're just like kittens. So they are. But do you notice there's a stream here? If you cross that stream, you could be in serious trouble. So it's that combination of something that's very attractive, but that's also very, very frightening. I should explain about tigers. He uses the name tigers all the time as a sort of generic term for big cats which aren't lions because they're stripy or spotty. So Stubbs knew perfectly well the difference between a leopard and a cheetah and a tiger, but he chooses to call them all tigers. As you go around the exhibition, you'll see that some of them are called tigers, some of them are called leopards. The reason for that is that I've given them titles which are not Stubbs's titles. Otherwise, we would have just got completely confused because we would have had half a dozen pictures all called a tiger. So that's why. Here's a different version of the same idea, and here they're close up. So you don't have that landscape to sort of mitigate the power of them. Staring at you with these incredible eyes, the eyes that really follow you around the room and really fix into you. I think this is going to be one of those popular pictures in the exhibition. And then finally we come to Stubbs's favourite subject, the lion and horse. If you had thought about Stubbs living in the 18th century, you would have associated him with something like this, rather than something like, say, the Charlton Hunt. The last part of the exhibition is about Stubbs as a technical innovator. And so it's in the little sort of cubicle part in the corner. We've kept the same structure as for Impressionism. So where you had that domestic section with all the lovely women and girls, here we've got prints and ceramic pictures. So Stubbs was a great printmaker. Here he is doing some etching. Very much a spare time activity, but the advantage of prints is that they promote his work to a wider audience. So his son is also a printmaker, George Townley Stubbs. He is a professional printmaker. So the equipment is very easily available to Stubbs. His first encounter with printmaking was actually while he was still in York, and he was working with an obstetrician called Dr. Burton. Dr. Burton asked Stubbs to publish a series of drawings of dissections that they had made together of an incredibly sensitive subject. New system of midwifery, all of the things that can go wrong in childbirth. And Stubbs had to try, and he didn't know how to do engraving, he didn't know how to do etching. He borrowed some tools, he didn't know what to do with them, and he sort of worked it out for himself and produced this incredible book. So he mostly does etching. Etching is easier than engraving in the sense that you don't have to scrape so hard on your copper plate. But his work attracts the interest of printmakers very early on. Oh, these are the anatomy. Again, the anatomy of the horse. He had to really develop his etching technique to make it sophisticated enough to make something like this. So this is one of the drawings in our exhibition transformed into a print, and alongside it he would do these diagrams, and it's marked with letters. All over there are little letters, and then over the page there's a key, and the letters tell you what all the different bits are. It gives you all the Latin names for all the different bits. But other printmakers are using his work. So, for instance, Benjamin Green, who engraves a slightly different version of The Fall of Phaeton. I never know which one it is. On the audio tour I said Phaeton, but I've changed my mind now. And Stubbs himself doesn't actually he doesn't publish an engraving until 1777. This is his first one, and this is in the exhibition. Do please look at it. I think we should try and get some magnifying glasses upstairs, because these really, really reward close looking. Then in 1788 he publishes a whole set of prints. Probably he's been working on them over many years, but the lion and horse is one of his favourite subjects that he revisits again and again and again. This is his only mezzo tint. This is the last thing that you'll see in the exhibition. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture of a tiger. It's actually, again, a leopard. It's only tiny, but do enjoy that. Mezzo tinting, of course, is quite a different technique from etching. I'll just take you through it very briefly. So you get your copper plate, you get this thing which is called a rocker, and you just rock all over the plate, and you cover it with lines, going one way, going the other way, until in the end it's like sandpaper. And then you get a burnisher, which is this smooth instrument here, and you rub off the sandpapery bits so that you get light emerging. So the more you rub, the more light you get. I hope that helps you to understand the technique, but there's tons of information online about how this is done. The other technique that he experiments with is enamelling. Again, enamelling is really, really difficult. This is from Diderot's encyclopedia. You have to use a kiln. You use this little mini kiln, which can fit inside your own domestic chimney. But if you use a mini kiln, then you can only produce things like the enamel miniatures, which we have, you know, the drawer that we have under the miniatures display that shows you how enamelling is done. That normally is the sort of size you would work at. If you worked any bigger, then your copper support would buckle in the kiln. And yet Stubbs, he just carries on regardless. He makes things like this. This is his first known enamel. And it's very big. It's 11 inches wide, so it's about this big. His largest enamel is the one in this portrait, which opens the exhibition. You can see half of it there. This does still exist, but I couldn't get a photograph of it. This is 42 inches wide, so that's about a metre for those of you who are still working in Continental. He then gets to this point where he realises you can't use copper, it doesn't go big enough. So he switches to ceramic, and at first he starts working on a very small scale in ceramic and produces this lovely thing, which you've seen blown up in the shop and on the banners at colossal scale. It's actually this big. But again, do look at that because it's beautifully done. It was very, very difficult to do because you had to keep firing all your layers of paint. It could very easily crack in the kiln. One of the lovely details that I learned from our enameller, Julie Byram, was that he would have used lavender oil. This is medium. So there would have been a beautiful smell as he was painting this. He's really looking at this tradition. So these are some plaques that were painted in the Sèvres factory, which would then be set into furniture. So that's what he's working on. But he wants bigger and bigger and bigger. So he writes to Josiah Wedgwood, who eventually is able to provide him with oval and oblong, quite big plaques, but it's almost impossible to do. So from Wedgwood's firing records, we know that he had a very low success rate. From May 1779, he put 94 of these tablets into the kiln, 39 survived intact, and so that's a less than 50% success rate. And yet he was able to make them as large as 42 inches wide. This is one in the exhibition. This is probably the first that was ever done on Wedgwood, and this one sits about this big. And this is a 42-incher. Beautiful, beautiful things. The sad thing is that he didn't sell a single one of these. And I think the reason was that they were neither one thing nor the other, and people were terrified of dropping them. So we've actually been quite brave putting them in our gallery. So just please bear in mind they are made of ceramic and a not nice bouncy canvas. Okay, so that's a look at the exhibition. I just did want to mention again the audio guide because I am so excited about it. Do encourage people to use it. Listen to it yourselves. I think you'll really enjoy it. Here are just some of our contributors. So we've got Simon King off the telly, we've got Wendy Moore, who's done some amazing biographies of completely weird 18th century people. And so her first big one was called The Knife Man, about John Hunter. She's going to come and talk about John Hunter in a couple of weeks' time. Do come along to that, because he is just the most incredible person. And Wendy tells the story very, very well. We also have Carl Hester, and I put this picture of him at the European Championship. He is a European champion. He's an Olympic gold medalist in dressage. And it was just a very short glimpse of what dressage involves. It involves making a horse want to do some incredible dancing, if you like. Its origins are in the army. It's all about controlling the horse and making the horse wish to be controlled. But it shows you the sort of thickness of the neck, which I know people will comment on. But these animals really do have very, very thick necks, because it's all in controlling the neck muscles. We've also got dotted around, we've got some of these dotted around in the permanent collection, so look out for these. They're just a sort of little teaser to get people across into the Roper Gallery. We've got a wonderful programme of events. Sophie's done a brilliant job of pulling together some really good speakers. You've probably all heard about the life drawing event that we're going to have with Sally Muir and her dog. So watch out for that, that'll be a bit different. Lots of lovely things going on in the Sackler room as well. We've got animal crackers, and you've probably noticed the mouse lemurs hiding around the place. Just one thing that I wanted to ask your help with over the next few days. Where this picture is, we've put a barrier in front of it, but we're not sure if it's too far out or if it needs to move. But if you could just watch how people behave in front of that, whether you think we need to move the barrier more in or more out, or if they're tripping over, or just if you could keep me and Nina posted about that. The other thing I should say is that this time we've actually bought our Farrow and wall paint. So we don't have a little sign up telling people what the colours are, but we'll make sure you've got a sheet at the desk that has the colours, because I know people like to ask what they are. Okay, so that's it. I better stop now, because you're probably all dying to get upstairs, get some fresh air as well.
Thank you.